Red rocks, blue mountains, white snow that falls with grace. Time stands still for nature's beauty in this place. Amidst the green trees lie orchards dead, a fractured heart in a community. Victims of the shadow side, and perpetrators with immunity.
Salt Lake City, commercially and culturally the lodestone of the West, a tribute to the foresight and wisdom of its founder, Brigham Young.
Salt Lake City is a timeless place. Though technology advances and the buildings rise, the heart of it all is a fossilized relic of the past.
Granite capital is a fitting symbol of this great commonwealth. Famous Eagle Gate makes a striking arch to the portal which led to Brigham Young's private estate.
Utah's archaic laws and cultural norms make it a safe haven for sexual predators.
Sculptured by Dolan, the statue represents Brigham Young in a characteristic pose and is an excellent likeness of him in his prime. Everything here bears the impress of this brilliant man, and our trip would not be complete without this.
Megan Waters, violence prevention specialist for the Utah Department of Health, explains the state's sexual violence numbers.
The state uses a couple statewide surveys. One of them is called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, and that's a statewide survey of adults in Utah, 18 years and older. It's a random telephone survey, and some of those figures were derived from that statewide survey. So self-reported, anonymously disclosed by real people who live in this state. There was also a study done called the Rape in Utah study in 2007, and that specifically is where we found the 1 in 3 number. They asked adults in Utah to explain about their experiences of sexual violence victimization, and 1 in 3 reported rape.
But what we have to remember is that 1 in 3 women in Utah will be a victim of sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. Those numbers are higher than New York, Washington, D.C., California. It's a problem in our community.
When we broke down the actual government spending on sexual violence, that 84.4% of that funding was going to perpetrators. That includes adjudication, incarceration, treatment for offenders, things like that. They found about 15% of the funding was being spent on victims, so victim services, medical care after victimization, and then just 0.5% on prevention.
The Kate Allen Show discusses film, entertainment, events, and social issues, and celebrates the uniqueness of being a woman and highlights local and national women-friendly businesses. Kate Allen interviews those involved in
but also you have a situation in Utah. So you have the 4th highest suicide rate in the country. You have Utah ranks in the top 10 for child sexual abuse, violence against children, domestic violence, a lot of pretty ugly things that Utah really should be paying attention to.
Because she follows these issues so closely, Kate voiced the need for a documentary on the topic of sexual violence in Utah.
We live in a state where genders are not equal. They are not equally paid. They are not equally treated. That is a risk factor for A, sexual violence, and then B, in terms of reporting. So if you look at the A study, there's several different risk factors, and unfortunately, Utah, we pretty much have them all.
It is necessary to have supervisors to direct the girls, as some of the work is not so simple.
As a society, we do not have a balance between our feminine and our masculine.
You know, a girl like you has to unbend a little. After all, you haven't had much experience.
Oh, but I'm willing to do anything. Well, I'm ambitious. Oh, why don't you give me a chance?
I'm offering you a chance right now.
Slut Walk is part of an international movement protesting rape culture and victim blaming in response to a police officer's viral 2011 comment that women should avoid dressing like sluts in order not to be victimized.
Unfortunately, I absolutely believe that we live in a rape culture. I think it's reflected in all that women do and are policed by, that rape culture.
So first you have to understand what a culture is, and a culture is a set of values and practices that a group of people they live up to, and they perpetuate based upon how they use language and how they condone certain behaviors. In a rape culture, what you have is a lot of instances where you have victim blaming, where a victim is somehow responsible for the rape that they experienced because of what they were wearing or what they said or certain behavior. And also because of that, it precludes any perpetrators from being prosecuted. And so we usually dismiss their behaviors and blame it upon the victim and allow perpetrators to keep on raping. And it justifies their behavior in our culture, and we see it as a value.
Tammy Robinson and Jenny Jackman, survivors, activists, and residents of Utah, co-founded Support Abuse Survivors and participated in Slut Walk 2016.
So you have this whole, you're not supposed to have sex until you're married, and you're taught that. And then when you finally get married and you have the go-ahead, you have the paper that says, I can now have sex, but sex is bad, right? So wait a minute, I'm supposed to like sex? How do I have a sexual relationship? I don't even know. And then on top of that, and this is super personal, but I used to feel guilty because it felt good. I used to think, oh, it's not supposed to feel good. And like, yeah, it is. But I had that disconnect. Mm-hmm. My body and my spirit were just not connected, and I didn't think it was okay. We've got to repair that connect and make it so it's okay. Because ultimately, it is supposed to build your relationship and make you closer and stronger. For me, that's the purpose of it. And it's enjoyable, of course. So no one is really, it's not discussed. And I think that leads to a lot of the date rapes that have happened. I've seen that happen personally within my family, and it's devastating. And I think a lot of that has to do with not being educated about consent.
I don't remember ever talking about sex in a healthy way. It was talked about in shame and hide yourself, and it's very private. And if you are, your value is in, no man's going to want to marry you if he can't take you to the temple. You got to be perfect.
Oh, honey, you make me so ashamed of you.
When parents behave this way 50 or 100 times over a period of time, the child automatically expects this kind of reaction. Without even thinking, in his young mind, he comes to believe that he's done something bad, something wrong. This undeserved guilt can carry over into childhood or even adulthood. In fact, the parents of the babies we just saw probably were themselves treated this way when they were younger. The child's whole attitude towards sex, then, is built on the premise that there is an element of badness in it.
Because we don't talk about sex in the Mormon culture, very, very limited. What we do talk about is we talk about how you need to stay morally clean and that you need to be married before you have sex, but we don't talk about it in any other regard or in any other capacity.
I think a lot of times when they go through the abuse, they try to handle it within the family or within the church, and they don't want to take it to the legal system. I can't say I blame them. Sometimes it's really hard to do that. But there are other resources, and that's what we want to be able to provide for them.
I hear it time and time again that, just go back to your family, everything will be okay, we'll do counseling, we'll sort of keep it all under wraps. And if there's anything that should never be kept under wraps, it's sex abuse.
Frankly, is issuing forth from the Mormon Church and the LDS, which is extremely influential and prevalent in state government.
I had a client once who was an adoptive daughter in an LDS family, and she and her sister were both sexually and otherwise physically abused by their adoptive father, Scott versus Hammock. It was in federal court. This is really interesting. I talked to the federal judge. I said, this involves communication with this man's Mormon bishop. You're Mormon, sort of goes to the core maybe of your religious doctrine. Maybe you should step aside. He said, his response to me was, well, if I step aside, you're just going to get another LDS judge, because every judge in this district is LDS. And I said, well, maybe you should assign it to somebody from outside. there needs to be an unbiased judge in this case. He said, no, I think I'll just certify it as a question of Utah law, state law, to the Utah Supreme Court. And I said, oh, so there I only have 4 out of 5 members of the LDS Church on the Utah Supreme Court.
Rocky has served the people of Salt Lake City for nearly 40 years. He has a track record of providing free legal services for the most vulnerable populations. His focus has been on sustainability, economic justice, restorative justice, and human rights. He has also served 2 terms as Salt Lake City's mayor and was considered the most environmentally friendly in the nation.
There is an obvious, very serious problem in Utah with the commission of sex crimes, how we deal with sex crimes, how we treat victims. There's a real cluelessness, I think, among people who claim religion, and yet they have such blinders on about sex. And I think a lot of it, frankly, is about sexual repression. What else can explain the fact that we, in Utah, are the #1 state in this country for subscription to online pornography sites?
There is no substantive reporting or research studies that tell you that pornography is unhealthy. I'm going to back up. There's one study that was commissioned by who? Oh, the LDS. So get your own guys to research it and come up with a lot of bogus statistics. But there's a UCLA study. There's studies out of, medical schools that completely contradict that finding. It's simply not true. That's a canard that's used when you want to, demonize the adult world.
We'll spend all sorts of money and legislation and regulations, all this on having Zion curtains so that children will never see an alcoholic drink mixed. But we don't deal in terms of public education with raising awareness and creating greater empathy to prevent the commission of heinous sex offenses that are devastating to so many lives.
Well, friends, we're going to have a lot of fun today, just as we always do. And more than that, we're going to tell a story which concerns all 30 million of America's school children.
The lack of sex education in the state aids in favor of the predators, leaving youth vulnerable to their manipulation.
They're the ones that'll have to answer the questions of our future. And perhaps today we can show how you can help them.
The governor has tried to gut sex education in the schools.
And every time we turn a blind eye to it, there's another individual that is victimized, that is perpetrated against. And we could be preventing that by pushing and advocating for these conversations to be had in our schools.
We should not be your sexual educators. We didn't sign up for that any more than Fast and Furious signed up to teach you how to drive. That's not what we do. But we have become that by default.
As children get a little older, there is a behavior pattern that is common to almost all boys and a large number of girls. I'm referring, of course, to masturbation. Let me at this point make a clear-cut scientific statement. Masturbation is not harmful. The young child often plays with his genitals, and after puberty, masturbation is a common release mechanism for the sex drive.
We cannot expect for our children to know the information when we're not providing them with the information.
On November 2nd, 2016, the Salt Lake Tribune hosted a panel of speakers on the topic of consent. This was on the heels of mounting reports of sexual assault on college campuses around the state.
One of the big things about consent is that we often only talk about it when it involves sex. And so we have this idea that that's the only moment where it matters, and we live in a weirdly paradoxical, prudish society. We often talk about sex, but also when we talk about ourselves and sex, we shut down. And you can, in fact, have conversations about consent that have nothing to do with sex, because consent is in every single relationship that we have. And so the fact that I'm working with my son who's 8 and I've never talked to him about consent and sex shows that like there are ways that we can be having much bigger conversations, and we can be talking about these things in all of the relationships that we have, not just the intimate ones, but that hopefully reflect so that when, or have an impact at least, so that when you are in an intimate moment, these are things that you're thinking about and practicing.
One of the laws on our books in Utah in 2015, this is quite an embarrassment, I covered it for the radio show, is that if someone was unconscious, that meant they gave consent. So if someone was asleep, if someone was drugged, if someone was beaten up, if for whatever reason they were unconscious, and someone decided to have sex with them, that was okay. Because they were unconscious, they gave consent.
So we've, for a long time now, I don't know, couple decades, the big slogan has been no means no, which is of course correct. If someone says no, it's no, and you should stop whatever it is that you're doing that they're telling you they don't want to do. But we're seeing this shift culturally, and then in some states like California, actually legally, to changing consent to yes means yes.
Well, the wording on that bill changed. So that passed to change the wording to say, nope, we don't do that anymore. We've learned as a society that's not okay anymore. You actually have to give consent. You have to give a verbal consent. Thumbs up, yeah, that's okay. Yes, I want to have sex with you.
I like to highlight what that shift actually means when we break it down. So no means no, if you think about like the moment when someone says no in an intimate moment, right? What no means no does is put all of the burden onto the person who's about to be victimized, right? They are the ones who have to say no. They have to fight off the person that, they have to do enough so that we feel that they indicated that they did not want whatever was going to happen, right? The entire burden of that moment is on the person who's about to be victimized.
When the perpetrator is in a position of power within a family, the inability to give consent is obvious.
It was actually my father who had been my abuser, and it was when I was young. I was between 2 and 5. So, I mean, obviously that is devastating, when you're 40 years old and your entire life doesn't look the way that you thought it was. I didn't tell anyone for a while. And finally my mom actually came to me and she said, I know who it was and I know what he did. I know it was your dad. And I just kind of melted into that little girl. It was like I turned into this little 6-year-old again, and I was so excited. I looked at my mom like, oh, she's gonna save me. She's gonna protect me, and she's gonna be my advocate. Like, I felt like the weight of the world lifted off, like I didn't have to protect myself anymore. Within a couple days, she went and talked to my dad, and my dad denied it. And she immediately turned against me and talked to my entire family about this, and kind of, I think just out of a lot of fear, she didn't want, it was kind of damage control. She talked to all my brothers, she talked to my extended family and even some of my friends, and it was about a year of just this back and forth, and you've betrayed our family, I don't think I can forgive you for this. And my dad's role in this was to disappear. He didn't really stand up to this at all. There were a couple times where I actually, I kind of forced him to look at me, and I looked right in his eyes and tried to have this conversation with him. The last conversation that we had, it was just him and I, and that was about a year ago. And I looked right in his eyes and I just said, Dad, you hurt me. And he couldn't look at me, and he said, I didn't hurt you. You've got to stop talking about this. I'm going to the temple.
On my dad's side of the family, we had an instance that was absolutely tragic in our family. Their parents went to the police. One of the sets of parents went to the police, and the other set just wanted to handle it through the church court, which is basically going to a bishop, talking to stake presidents, that sort of thing. And then the punishment in the church court, it can be a disfellowship, which means you're not allowed to pray or hold a calling in church, or you can be excommunicated, which means your records are completely terminated from the church.
You know, you've got all male officials. It's a patriarchy. Nobody can argue that this is not a patriarchal culture in the LDS Church. And so a female child going to a bunch of men who have no training to deal with this internally, that's insane on every single level.
And I really believe that because that exists, just the simple fact that it's actually available to go through a church court proceeding, in no way is that okay, because the legal system is here for a reason, and I was always taught that we respect that. We respect what they're there to do. We respect their job, and their job is to make sure that justice happens. And then I think there can be a reckoning within the church. You know, after there is a legal reckoning, then I think that comes, you know, later on.
Yes means yes literally shifts that so that each person has equal responsibility in that moment to make sure that the other person wants to be doing whatever it is that they're about to do.
We really have to stop pushing against, like, what you can do to keep yourself safe, what we can do to keep ourselves safe is have individuals engage in this conversation from all genders, from all orientations, from all communities, from all socioeconomic classes, because this is something that impacts all of us.
Jenny and I had been friends for years and years and years, and kind of came together in the commonality that we wanted to start speaking up and make a difference for sexual abuse survivors, but as well, you know, abuse survivors in general. And we realized that, especially here in Utah, there was such an oppression in our culture, and that people really weren't talking about it. It was very much swept under the carpet. Her and I both experienced that in our own lives, and we realized that there's a victimization that was happening over and over again for people, because, you know, people question, are you sure? Are you sure that really happened? Why were you out late at night? You know, so these secondary victimization questions that people were giving to the survivors, it just was so damaging. We started to really see that there was a need to start educating the community on believing people and supporting them in their journey, because if they're brave enough to say it, you know, they deserve that support.
Back in 2015, we were the second state in the nation to pass the Start by Believing legislation. And it is a very simple legislation. It is when someone discloses to you that they have been sexually abused or sexually assaulted or violated in any capacity, you start by believing. Well, what does that mean? That means all government entities, including the police, that's your job. That's your job. When someone gives you a disclosure, you're supposed to start by believing. You don't start by judging. You don't start by accusing. You start by believing. That looks like this. Someone says, you know, I was sexually assaulted last week while I was on campus and I was walking home, and then I was so scared I didn't know what to do. I went home and showered. You know what the appropriate response is? I am so sorry. That should have never happened to you. I believe you. And then the next response is, would you like access to resources for healing?
We need good, dedicated people who are educated, who are sensitive about these issues in law enforcement, and then we need to educate our legislators as well, so that we start putting in place programs that will really help restore everyone, and not just focus on after the fact punishment and retribution. We've got to prevent these things from happening to the extent possible in the first place.
My name is Deanne Tilton, and I founded a local nonprofit here in Salt Lake City called Talk to a Survivor, and the goal of our nonprofit is to mobilize communities to end sexual violence here in Utah. So Start by Believing, these are to let people know that you're a safe person to disclose sexual assault. So if someone comes to you and says something's happened, you will start by believing them. And Start by Believing doesn't mean end by believing. Oh my God.
The Start by Believing campaign is one example of a reaction to really improve the responses of communities and of systems to victims who do come forward with their story. They don't have to. Victims don't have to do anything, but when they do, they should be met with support.
If something has happened that warrants a report, that you start by believing, and you let the jury, end by believing, or whatever they're going to do.
So the Start by Believing campaign, that's really their main goal, is to make sure we're responding supportively and effectively so that that victim isn't re-victimized.
The people that work on our set deserve to have their boundaries intact. Every single one of us do.
Part of Deanne Tilton's advocacy work is training community members to engage in best practices concerning consent, shifting idle bystander behavior to active intervention.
There's something called the bystander effect, which is it's also called social loafing, but if one person is hurt right here and I'm the only other person in the room, I'm much more likely to be like, oh my gosh, and respond. The more people that are in the room, the fewer anyone feels individually responsible.
If you saw someone sexually harassing someone else, that you had someone intervene, a third party to say, hey, maybe they're not willing to address it, but just to interrupt it. To say, hey, you know what, what's your name? I don't think I've met you. That changes everything. That is bystander intervention.
Distract. So that's kind of distract, start that conversation. Someone else had said, well, you could spill a drink. I mean, I don't know how high stakes you want to get.
I would love to see everyone trained in these things, because we know statistically that once someone is trained in bystander intervention, specifically in darkness to light training, only 5% of the population. I mean, we've got about 3 million people in the state of Utah. That means if only 150,000 people are trained in this, that's when our social norms change. That's only 5%. It's so little. We just have to provide this education for people out there so they know, oh, if I see someone coercing a child, whether it's a tickling war or it's any form of things that are just inappropriate, and you can see the child's face just feeling like, get me out of here. It's so uncomfortable that you have a bystander say, hey, you know what? It looks like Susie's feeling really uncomfortable. How about we change the game? Let's do a board game instead. So what you've done right there is you've acknowledged to the child to say, hey, I saw what's going on. B, to the person doing it, that's not okay. And then C, we're going to do a different thing now. So you have intervened and you've stopped that behavior. Well, what we know with child sex predators is that they will specifically do grooming behaviors in front of other adults to see if anyone will stop them. And if no other adult will intervene, they will keep upping the ante to keep grooming. And so how do we prevent sexual violence from happening? We educate. And then we get people to actually start acting on it. It's very easy to do. And I would love to see legislation passed for this, because you know what? No one should be abused. Absolutely no human being, no animal should ever be abused. It is not okay.
Sexual violence is about your home being invaded. So if you can't come home to a safe place, which is your body, you can never really get home again without significant therapy, intervention, significant support, and a lot of time. I really can't think of anything more harmful.
Well, I think that you've brought up a couple of key points that I think as an outsider looking in is things that we need to look at as Utah citizens. So I appreciate you coming on the show for bringing up these things. I appreciate your perspective on this, on how we have an opportunity to look at this and say, we need to make some changes.
I mean, can you ever go wrong just talking?